Welcome to my introduction to Flutter for beginners. I have created this tutorial to help you get started with Flutter. The material that you'll see here is one of the initial chapters of my Flutter and Firebase course on Udemy, where I teach how to build a complete time tracking application for iOS and Android using Flutter and Firebase. As I record this, my course is just about to reach 5,000 students, and for this occasion I've decided to make some of this content available for free. So this tutorial groups together all the lessons from my introduction to Flutter in this course. As part of this, I'll give you a short introduction to Flutter, then I'll show you how to create a new Flutter project, and we'll take a walkthrough of all the generated code, learning about the Flutter widget tree, as well as stateless and stateful widgets, how to reload and how to restart. And I will also explain how the default counter application works in detail. So this is a good starting point if you are new to Flutter and want to learn about the basics. And because this tutorial is for beginners, we'll take it nice and slow. And just to be clear, this tutorial dives straight into Flutter and doesn't cover the Dart language in detail. So if you are new to Dart, I recommend that you follow my introduction to Dart, which is freely available as a playlist on my YouTube channel. So I hope you enjoy the rest of this tutorial, and if you're serious about learning Flutter and Firebase, you should consider enrolling in my full course, which contains 22 hours of content and goes well beyond the basics. And you can buy the course for a discounted price on my website at codewithandrea.com or using the link in the description below. Okay, so let's get started with an introduction to Flutter. In this video, we will see what is Flutter and how it works. Flutter is a mobile UI framework developed by Google, which allows you to build mobile apps for both iOS and Android with one single codebase. One phrase that you will hear a lot is that in Flutter, everything is a widget. Widgets are the basic building blocks of the user interface of any Flutter app. Anything that we build in Flutter from a single page to a full app is done by combining widgets together into a widget tree. So we can take as an example the time tracker app that we are going to build. Here we have a sign-in page. The title at the top is a widget. The purple bar that sits at the top is a widget itself. The entire gray area that we see over here is a container widget, and so is the sign-in label. All the buttons that you see here are widgets as well, and even the logos for the Google and Facebook sign-in buttons are widgets themselves. So the way we would create a page like this is by composing widgets together into a hierarchy, and we will see in detail exactly how this is done. Now, this screen over here is just a simple page in our time tracker app, but in Flutter, everything is made of widgets, and in fact, even the entire app itself is a widget. As we will see, Flutter has a rich set of widgets that come out of the box, and you can use them to build your own layouts. Naturally, when you build an app in Flutter, you are combining widgets together, and by doing that, you create your own widgets. So how can we use Flutter to build apps that run on iOS and Android? Well, we have discovered that to write a Flutter app, we need to write Dart code, and this is going to use widgets and APIs from the Flutter SDK. Then we can choose to compile this into native code for iOS and Android. So when we are developing our own apps, we can compile and run them in debug mode on the iOS simulator and Android emulator, or if we prefer, we can run them on a real device. And once our code is ready, we can compile our apps in release mode, and when we do this, our apps will be optimized for best performance. In summary, in this video we have seen how everything that we build in Flutter is made of widgets, and to write an app in Flutter we need to write code in Dart, and this is then compiled into native code for iOS and Android. Before we start building apps in Flutter, we need to download the Flutter SDK, and we'll also need to download and configure an IDE, which is the program that we will use to write our Flutter apps. So if you haven't installed Flutter yet, you can head over to flutter.dev and click on the Get Started button, and then you can go ahead and follow the instructions for your platform. And after you have done this, you should be able to open a terminal and type Flutter Doctor, and if everything is installed correctly, then you see green check marks for all these items. By the way, in this tutorial we will use Android Studio, but you should be able to follow along just fine if you have Visual Studio Code. Similarly, I will be using the iOS simulator, but feel free to run on the Android emulator if you prefer. Okay, so we can continue on the next lesson where we will create a new Flutter project. And if you are new to Dart, I recommend that you follow my introduction to Dart, which is freely available as a playlist here on my channel. Okay, so let's continue on the next lesson. Okay, so we are now ready to create a new project, which is going to be our time tracker app. So this window over here is Android Studio, and we can see that we have an option to start a new Flutter project. So we are going to do that, and we are presented with a template. So here we have a few options depending on what type of project we want to create. For now, we're just happy with the default Flutter application option here, so we're going to tap Next. Here we get to choose the project name for our application. So in this case, I'm going to call it Time Tracker Flutter Course. And I recommend that you use exactly this name so that there are no differences between your code and mine as we make progress. The other options are the Flutter SDK path, which we had configured when we installed Flutter, and also a folder where this project will be saved. So we're going to tap Next, and then we get the option to choose the company name for our project. So here the IDE is showing codingwithflutter.com as the company domain, and this is my website for learning Flutter. Obviously you could choose a different company domain if you wanted to. As you can see, there is also a package name here which is generated by the IDE, and that will be created using the company domain that you have provided, as well as the project name that we have set up in the previous step. Now, this package name is something that we'll get back to when we will configure our project to run with Firebase. But I will show you where to find your package name later in case you forget it. So for now, don't worry about it and just choose anything you want. Down here, we have two options to choose the platform channel language. So here we are presented with an option to choose Kotlin for Android and Swift for iOS. This refers to the language that is used when creating the Android and iOS host applications. So if you remember, on the introduction to this course, I mentioned that Flutter projects are always compiled into native code. What that means is that every time you create a Flutter project, it will also generate projects for native iOS and Android. These options are here so that you can choose whether the iOS and Android projects will be set up with Kotlin and Swift as their default programming language. In any case, we don't need to worry about this for now, so we're just gonna go ahead and leave the default options enabled. But just to be aware, these will be the languages that you would be using if you were to write native platforms code for your Flutter apps. Okay, so we are now ready to complete the setup, and we can tap on Finish. And this is now going to create our project. So it will create the project and set it up so that we can run our application. Just so you know, this follows the same steps that would be performed if we did create the project from the command line. So there is no magic here. Okay, so now our project has been created, and in the next video we'll take a look around at the project so that we can get familiar with how a Flutter project is structured and organized. Before we get started and dive into the code, I think it would be a good idea to take a quick tour of the project. On the left side of the IDE, we can see that there is a project inspector panel that you can toggle over here. And this shows us all the files that are in the project. So this is what we can use to navigate around and look for things. As we can see, there are 4 main folders over here. And these are always going to be created when you start a new Flutter project. So they are going to be Android, iOS, lib, and test. In addition to this, there are a number of other files, and we'll look into this more in detail at the right time. But for now, I just want to focus on these folders. So the first two are Android and iOS. And as I said before, every Flutter app compiles into native code. So inside these folders, you can find the actual projects that you would use if you were developing a standalone or Android or iOS app. As a matter of fact, you could open these folders as projects themselves with Android Studio or Xcode. So if you want to do that, for example, on iOS, you could do it directly from here with right-click, then choosing Flutter, and you could choose to open the module with Xcode. Now, this is not what we're going to do now, and instead I want to focus on the lib folder over here. So by convention, lib is the folder that contains all the Dart code that belongs to your app. So any code that we are going to write on this course will be saved inside lib or any subdirectories that we will create as we go along. So when you create a project, there is only one file in here, and that file is called main.dart. This is the file that we see here on the right, and we can edit the code here if we want to. Now, before we move on, there is one more thing that I want to show you, and that is that you can always have a terminal available to you inside the IDE, and this is located down over here. So if you open this up, you'll find that you are in a directory where the project is saved. So this is where we created our project. And you can get a list of files, or you can invoke any Flutter commands that you want from here. So we might use this from time to time, but for now, I just wanted to let you know that it's over here if you ever need it. In the last video, we've taken a quick tour of the project. One interesting thing that we could try to do at this stage would be to run our app so that we can get our iOS simulator up and running. Now, unless you have already started your iOS simulator or Android emulator, you will see that there are no devices that you can choose to run the app with. To solve this problem, you can run the simulator that you have installed on your system. For iOS, you can do that with Spotlight. So I'm going to press Command Space and type in simulator. And this is going to launch it. So once this is up and running, I'm just gonna move it here and make it a little bit bigger. So at any time, you can choose to run on a different simulator if you want to, and you can do that by choosing the hardware menu over here and go to device, and here you have a list of devices that you can choose to use instead. As you can see, now that the simulator is up and running, it will show up in our IDE over here. Of course, you could choose to run on the Android emulator instead. So if you want to do that, you can open the AVD manager, which is located on this icon over here. And here we find the device that we previously installed when we configured our Android Studio. So let's try that and press the play button in here. So the Android emulator starts up, and as you can see, once the emulator is running, you can choose the drop down on the IDE over here, and this gives you an option to now choose between iPhone and Android SDK. So this is how you can switch between devices that you want to run your app. Okay, so now that we have both the iOS simulator and the Android emulator up and running, we can try to run the sample app, and we'll do this in the next video. So I'm just gonna start this for iOS, and then in the next video I'll come back with when the app is started. Okay, so the app has now started, and what you're looking at over here is a sample application that is always generated when you create a new Flutter project. I believe it would be useful to take a quick look at what it does, and in a short while we can start getting familiar with the source code. So on this screen, we can see a few elements. There is a blue bar at the top, which is where we show the title for our app. And then in the middle, we can see a text and then a counter, which is currently showing the value 0. And at the bottom, we have a floating action button, or FAB, which is a component that is quite common in material design. So what happens when we press the FAB is that the counter value increments. And this is all our application does, nothing else. So for now, I'm not going to explain all these code line by line, because the first thing that I want to do is to show you a very powerful feature of Flutter called hot reload. So we'll take a look at this in the next video. Hot reload is one of the most powerful features of Flutter. What you can do with it is to make changes to your code and reload the application on the fly so that you can see the changes take effect without recompiling the whole app. So let's see this in action, and let's try to change the color of the main theme in the app. So the way we can do this is by locating this theme data object and change the color of the primary swatch to something else. So let's try this. We delete blue, and then we can see that the editor is nice and it shows us the list of available colors. And let's change this, for example, to indigo. Now, once we have made the change, all we have to do is to hit this lightning icon over here, and we can see that the app updates immediately. This is really cool, and I can assure you that we'll be using hot reload a lot during this course. So at this stage, it will be useful to learn the shortcut that we can use to trigger it. So if we hover over the icon, the IDE suggests that the shortcut for hot reload is /. And hot reload also takes place even by saving the file that we are editing currently. And you can just do that by pressing Command S. Okay, so hot reload is pretty cool, but it also has a bigger brother, which is called hot restart. Hot restart is useful when you want to restart your application entirely by restoring the initial state. Once an application is running, you can hot restart it simply by pressing the play button again over here. So if you remember, when we started this app, the initial counter value was set to 0. And so now that we have hot restarted the app, we can see that this has been reset. Okay, so let's see if we can do something useful with hot restart. If we scroll down this file, we can find a line where we declare our counter to be an integer and with an initial value set to 0. So what we could do here, for example, is to change this initial value to 5 and then hot restart the app. So I'm going to change it and then press Ctrl R, which will restart my application. And then we can see that the counter value has updated. Now, if I change this value again, for example, to 10, but hot reloaded the app rather than hot restarted, so I can do this here, then I can see that nothing happens. And the reason for that is that hot reload only updates the app according to the current state. But because here I'm changing the initial state, if I want this change to take effect, I really need to perform a hot restart instead. So I can do that, and I can see that now the counter is updated. So just to make this clear, hot reload and hot restart serve two different purposes. Hot reload is for updating the app based on the current state. Hot restart restarts the entire app, and because of this, it takes into account changes to the initial state as well. For now, you don't need to worry too much about knowing exactly when one or the other needs to be used. And also, as our app will increase in complexity, it won't be always obvious which one to choose. But I will try to point this out as we make progress. One final comment that I want to make about hot reload is that it really makes the development workflow very quick, because you can make code changes and always see the effect in less than a second, almost real time. So to make the most out of hot reload, I always have my simulator window next to my editor, and I suggest that you do the same, because as I said, this really makes for a nice and fast development workflow. In the last video, we've taken a first look at hot reload and hot restart, and these are tools that we'll use throughout this course. Soon enough, we'll start building the time tracking application that we have seen at the beginning of this course. But before we do that, I want to walk you through this code that comes with the Flutter project we have created. The reason for this is that I want to explain some initial concepts that will help you getting started. So in this video, we will start learning about what is a widget and how to build widgets and how to compose them together. So here it goes. A widget is an object that describes a part of the user interface. So every time you see something visible on screen, that is there because it has been added as a widget to your app. So for example, this text that we see here is a widget. And for the remainder of this course, every time I say the word widget, you can think about something that will show on the screen. So let's look at this specific file. At the top, we have this line which says void main, and this is the entry point of our entire application. What this method does is to make a call to this other method called runApp, and then it passes one parameter called myApp. By doing this, we are saying that we have a widget called myApp, and this is going to be the top level widget of our application. MyApp is a widget that is defined over here. So it is a class, its name is MyApp, and it extends another class called Stateless widget. What is a stateless widget? We will look at this in more detail a little bit later, but for now I will just say that it is a widget and that it has no state. Now every class that extends from stateless widget needs to implement a method called build. And the build method describes the part of the user interface which is represented by this widget. So the build method returns a widget, and what this code does is to return a widget called MaterialApp. So let's talk about MaterialApp in the next video. What is a MaterialApp? It is an application that uses Material Design, which is a design system for building UIs. By the way, MaterialApp is the second widget that we have encountered so far, the first one being Stateless widget. And at any point, if you want, you can pause the video and go and read the documentation for these widgets yourself. So I've just done this by pressing Command Tab on the symbol that I want, and this has taken me to the documentation for MaterialApp. So if I wanted to learn more about MaterialApp, I can go above here in the class definition, and to the top I can find all the documentation for MaterialApp. And I have to say, the Flutter source code has some great documentation, and this is an excellent place to learn more about the rich set of widgets that are provided by the Flutter SDK. In any case, we can go back and continue. And here we are using MaterialApp. So that means that the application that we are building is going to conform to the look and feel that is defined by Material Design. MaterialApp is a widget that takes a number of properties. The first one is the title, which is the title of our application, and then it takes a theme, which defines a theme data object. That is the theme of our application, and this is where define a primary swatch, which is the primary color that is used in our application. So this is what you currently see in the top application bar over here and on this button down here. Finally, we have a home, which is the main widget that is displayed by our MaterialApp. Alright, so this is quite a bit of material that we've already covered, so let's take a break and continue on the next video. In the last video, we have seen how to use MaterialApp inside the build method of our application widget, which is called myApp. MaterialApp defines a home property, and to this property we pass a widget which is called myHomePage, which is defined over here. As we can see, myHomePage extends from stateful widget, and this is a widget that has mutable state. Now, I want to talk more in detail about stateful widget and stateless widget in one of the upcoming videos. For now, I just want to focus on the build method that is defined over here. Earlier on, we have seen that the myApp class also has a build method, and in here we were returning a MaterialApp. So if we go down here, we also have a build method, and this returns a new widget which is called Scaffold. Let's take a quick look at the documentation for Scaffold. So if I tap through, I can scroll up, and then I can see that Scaffold implements the basic material design visual layout structure. So down here, we can see all the properties that we can add to our scaffold. And if we head back to our main file, we can see that the ones being used are up bar, the body, and the floating action button down here. Now, just to give you some visual feedback about what Scaffold does, let's try, for example, to comment out the up bar and hit save to hot reload. And we can see that the top application bar over here has disappeared. Similarly, we could go down here and comment out the floating action button, and if we save again, we also see that this disappears. Okay, let's add them back like this and save. So what we are discovering here is that by adding certain widgets to our scaffold, these appear in place according to how Scaffold lays things out in the visual layout structure. One important point that I want to make is that the build method gives us a way to declare how we want our UI to look like. As you can see, we can do this by composing widgets together. So let's do a quick zoom out and review what we have learned. In the last few videos, we have seen how to compose the UI of our application by using a number of different widgets. In some cases, we have been using widgets that were provided by the Flutter SDK, such as MaterialApp or Scaffold. In other cases, we have built our own widgets by extending from either Stateless widget or stateful widget. In any case, we have always encountered a build method, which is where we declare how our widgets are composed together. So what we have learned is that in Flutter, UIs are always defined declaratively, and this will always be the case with all the Flutter code we write. The place where this happens is always going to be in the build method of the widgets that we define. By composing widgets together in this fashion, we define something that is called a widget tree. So at this stage, I'd like to show you a diagram of the widget tree for this app that we've been looking at. So this is the widget tree that represents the hierarchy that we have defined in the source code. So at the top, as we have seen, we have a class called myApp, which is what we can see over here. And this then defines a MaterialApp inside the build method. MaterialApp defines some properties, but also a home property where we create this my home page, which I represented here. Home page is a stateful widget. So let me just open this up a bit more. And if we can see how this is declared, it has a build method, which is where we define the scaffold, and the scaffold itself defines an application bar, a body, which is a center widget, and a floating action button, which is down here. And each one of these widgets themselves also define some children. So up bar has a title, which is a text. Center has a child, which is a column, and this column itself has an array of children, which is defined by two text widgets. So this is where they are. And the floating action button itself also has a child, which is defined to be an icon over here. Alright, so the reason that I'm showing you this diagram is that there is a point that I'm trying to drive home. So let me say this once again. In Flutter, we always declare our UI by composing widgets together into a widget tree. So even though the application that we are going to build is much more complex than this one that we are seeing here, the principle still stands. So what is great about this is that no matter how complex our applications are going to be, we can always find a way to break them up by defining our own widget classes and combining them together. And this is actually an approach to problem solving that is called bottom-up. Alright, so we have seen what a widget tree is and how widget composition works. I had promised that I would talk more about stateless widget and stateful widget, and so I will do that in the next video. In the previous videos, we have seen how in Flutter we can define our own widgets. So far, we have seen one example of stateless widget, and one example of stateful widget. So to summarize, a stateless widget is a widget that can have some configuration properties, and these are passed in when the widget is created in the build method. However, these properties are all immutable, which means that they can't ever change. As a result, the user interface that is described by that widget is always going to be rendered in the same way. So once again, when we create a stateless widget with some properties, that widget will not have mutable state, and so it will always look the same. In contrast to that is a stateful widget. A stateful widget can also be given some configuration when it is built, but in addition to that, it can define some mutable state. State is data which might vary during the life cycle of the widget, and because of this, state defines the behavior of the widget. So it is possible for a stateful widget to update its state, and when this happens, the widget itself is rebuilt. As a result, the UI that the widget describes might change. So let's take a look at how this works in practice. So if we go back to our code, we can see that my home page is a stateful widget. This widget takes a key and a title as configuration objects, and then it defines a state object via the createState method. Now, the way we define a state object is by creating a class, giving it a name, and then extend state with my home page in Angular brackets. Now, for the moment, don't worry too much about all of this syntax. We will get back to this later. But just so you know, when you create a stateful widget, you always have to follow this pattern. You create a class that extends stateful widget, you implement the createState method, and have this return an instance of the corresponding state class. And the state class should extend state of the original class itself. Once you have done this, the last required step is to implement the build method in the state class, just as you would do for a stateless widget. Now, if you remember, this page over here is a simple counter example. Now, because the counter value itself is something that needs to change, the page has been implemented as a stateful widget. So how does the counter work? First of all, we define a counter over here of type int, and we give it an initial value of 10. Then we can see this increment counter method over here. If we scroll down, we can see that the increment counter method is called on the onPressed event callback of the floating action button that we have defined. So what happens when we tap on the button is that increment counter is called, and inside here there is this method call to setState, and inside here we increment our counter. Now, setState is where all the magic happens. So what happens when we call setState is that the Flutter SDK triggers a rebuild of the widget. So when we call setState, the build method is called again, and because the counter value has been updated, then our text widget, which is defined over here, updates its own value. And this is why we can see that the counter is updated on the screen. So setState is super important, and it is the most fundamental way that we have of updating state in Flutter. So to summarize, we have seen the difference between stateless and stateful widgets, and we have learned how we can use stateful widgets to define widgets that can update themselves by changing state. We have seen that inside a stateful widget state, we can define mutable state variables, and that we can use this to change the way that the widget UI is rendered, provided that we call setState so that the widget is rebuilt. In the last few videos, we have done a walkthrough of this sample counter application, and we have learned a few interesting things in the process. So to summarize, We have talked about widgets, what they are and how they are used. We have explored the MaterialApp and Scaffold widgets from the Flutter SDK. We have reviewed the code to understand how widgets are composed together to form a widget tree. We have also learned the difference between stateless and stateful widgets, and we have seen how the counterexample actually works by updating state and triggering a rebuild of the stateful widget. There are quite a few details that I've missed or not covered as part of this overview. Don't worry, I won't leave anything behind and we'll get to cover all the basics as we go forward. For now, my goal was to give you a basic understanding of how widgets work and how a Flutter app works. In the next video, we'll start building our time tracker app from scratch, and that will be a good occasion to cover any details that I've missed so far. So let's continue on the next video. Okay, so this concludes our introduction to Flutter. As I said before, my complete Flutter and Firebase course covers this and many other topics that are essential if you want to build robust and maintainable apps that can run in production. And I believe that nearly 5,000 students and a rating of 4.7 stars are a testament to the quality of this course. Once again, you can buy the course for a discounted price on my website at codewithandrea.com or using the link in the description below. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.